There are some people I understand who could walk up to the Queen of England and have a nice casual conversation. You know, how you doing, fist bump? What's up? Most people cannot do that. Typically, we feel a little bit uncomfortable around people who have some notoriety about them. You know, the Queen of England, a president of the United States, maybe a sports star, maybe a famous actor. We would be a little bit uncomfortable around those people, and this is true of almost everyone, but there's always some exceptions. So, what about people with Asperger syndrome? What is it like when we try to have a conversation with just a normal person, not the Queen of England, not a president, not a famous icon, celebrity, but just anybody? Well, we tend to feel the same way that neurotypical people would feel around the Queen of England. You know, everyone's the Queen of England. We don't know how to talk to them. We don't know what to say. We feel uncomfortable in their presence. We feel a little bit self-conscious, maybe even, well, not maybe, but typically inferior, just being in their presence. So it's really hard for us to have appropriate social interactions with almost anybody. So number one is this: we have limited interactions, and there's a reason for having limited interactions. It's because we have limited interacting. So it's hard for us to interact with an individual. And because of that, we don't interact with individuals. We just don't have the conversation to begin with because we know it's going to be a failure. Social defeat. It's not going to come across well. And what's worse is when we do try to communicate, when we try to talk to an individual, there's something that happens inside our brain that I don't know the clinical term for it, so I just call it brain scrambling. At least that's true with me. When I am called upon to talk to somebody, I say called upon when the opportunity presents itself, something inside my brain just it's kind of like it goes haywire. 1 second I'm okay, I'm perfectly fine, I'm thinking in a straight line, everything is normal, everything is centered, and somebody says, "Hey, how you doing?" It's like there's an explosion, a quiet explosion in my brain, and everything is out of order, and I can't talk. And when I try to talk, it's nonsensical. It sounds weird to the person listening to it, and well, it sounds weird to me. I can't believe I said something that dumb. So we have limited interactions because we have limited interacting, and it's natural. It's not something we can help. It's something we can work on. It's something we can learn to deal with, but I don't think it ever completely goes away. We can mask it pretty good if we really, really work on it. But even then, most Aspies that I talk to tell me that they still don't like to do it. Even though they may be able to come across as neurotypical, the discomfort is still there. It's just the surface masking that allows them to get away with it. And by the way, most Aspies, I don't think, at least the ones that I've talked to, I don't think they mind the social circumstances as much as they like the pressure when they are called upon to be a participant. My circumstance, I just don't like to be around people in general at all. I don't like to be around crowds, don't like to be around groups. Number two is what we would call inappropriate actions and inappropriate reactions. Do you know how to behave around people? I don't know why people generally have an innate sense of how you're supposed to behave when other people are in their presence. When you're in close proximity with other people, you try not to touch them, you try not to do this, try not to do that, try not to breathe down their neck, so to speak. That just comes natural with people except for people with Asperger syndrome. Sometimes, we get ourselves into trouble. And it's not intentional, just because, we're just blind. There's this blindness in our brain that we don't know what our actions should be. In fact, sometimes we don't even think about it. We just act inappropriately, no thought whatsoever. It just comes out. And immediately we're labeled as a little bit weird, a little bit strange, and sometimes not a little bit, sometimes quite a bit strange and weird. You know, some of the embarrassing moments I've had in my life. Oh, the stories I could tell. So we have inappropriate actions and sometimes inappropriate reactions. So somebody is talking to us, having a conversation with us, and we don't know how to respond. We don't know what to say back. Somebody says hello, and we say, what? Or we don't say anything, particularly when you're younger. You know, when I was a kid, a typical conversation with an adult would be, the adult would say, how are you doing? And my response would be, fine. That's the end of the conversation. Now, other kids my age, somebody would say, how you doing? And the other kid would talk their arm off. I mean, he'd actually tell them how his day was at school, what sports he's playing, what games he's playing. He'd tell them all about his family, and the adult would, be sorry if he even asked because the kid won't shut up. Not true with most Aspergers. Now, there are some people with Asperger syndrome who do that. They overtalk, they overreact, they overread into what other people want to hear. Number 3 is limited eye contact. Most people with Asperger syndrome don't like to look people in the eye. I don't know why, but I don't. Even if I'm looking at a photograph, I don't like to look the photograph in the eye. It's not even a real person. It's just or a painting. It's not even a photograph of a real person. It's somebody's rendition. But still, there's something in my brain. I don't know what it is. I'm going to leave that up to the technicians to explain. But I don't like to make eye contact. That is very common among Aspergers. I remember when I was a kid, I've told this story a couple times in other videos, but when I was, I don't know, maybe 10, 11, 12 years old, somewhere in that age range, my dad would do wallpapering and painting for other people, you know, kind of a side hustle to earn extra income. I'd go along to help. Not that I helped, but I would go along to help. Big difference. And I recall this one woman, I remember because she was German, and I love German people, took German in high school. But she was kind of a nuisance because it bothered her immensely that I would not make eye contact, and she said something that I thought was a little bit off. So talking about inappropriate action, she was the one who was being inappropriate. And she said something to the effect that people who don't make eye contact are bad people. You know, that thing that the eyes are the windows of the soul. So if you don't make eye contact, apparently you've got a bad soul or something. She didn't say that. But that was one thing that stuck in my mind. The people notice that you don't make eye contact. But even after she said it, I still couldn't make eye contact. She got mad at me. She was really offended, or at least she pretended to be. It could be she was just so arrogant she didn't like the idea that she was being defied, but she was trying to trick me into making eye contact. What do you do with that? Well, as you get older, sometimes you learn little tricks, like you look for somebody's eye color, or, you know, you look near their eye but not in their eye, or you glance at their eye, or you play a game where I'm going to stare at you until you look away. You know, staring game. That's a little bit tough to do, but, you know, it works, makes you the other people a little bit uncomfortable. Number 4 is reading gestures. So gesturing with your hand or with your face, with your eyebrows, you know, people communicate a lot with their faces. You ever seen a dog communicate with his ears? Or a dog communicate with his tail? People communicate with their faces. It's kind of like a visual communication. There is audio communication. Obviously, we communicate with our voice and we communicate with our faces, facial expressions. But just like people with Asperger syndrome may misread what somebody is saying, we may, with audibly, we may misread their gestures, particularly their facial gestures, expressions. So they're looking at us angrily, and we think they're looking at us with inquisitively, or vice versa. You know, we get them confused. Not every Aspie does that. I don't think I do that too much, but a lot of people do. So we have difficulty reading gestures. Number 5 is we have difficulty understanding emotional signs. This is a little bit akin to misunderstanding gestures because it's nonverbal. So some people, well, you think they are crying when in reality they're laughing. That doesn't happen often, but it could happen. But people who are down in the dumps, maybe a little bit depressed, and we just don't pick up on it. We don't understand what this person, what their brain, what their mind is going through. Now, that's a little bit challenging, particularly if you're married or if you're in a close relationship, that the other person expects empathy from you. And we have no problem with that type of empathy, effective empathy, except we just don't read the signs, so we don't know that, well, we're not triggered. Our button is not pushed, so it doesn't come out. So we don't always understand emotional signs. Number 6 is because of all the above, we tend to be isolated. We have very few friends. If you were to ask the average person that you know, how many friends do you have? Most of them would say probably 5 to 10, I would guess. I didn't do research on that. I'm just guessing off the top of my head. But I'm talking about really close friends. Something bad happens in your life, you call these people up first. Who are these people? Who is on your A list? Well, if you are a person with autism or Asperger syndrome, chances are you have a very short or non-existent list. You don't have an A list. You may have a B list, people that you know, they're not your friends. People maybe you can confide in a little bit, but they're not your friends. But when you stop to think of my A list, no, I can't think of anybody, or maybe 1 or 2 people. Now, I'm not including close family members in this. I'm talking about people who are not related to you. Who do you know that you consider a good friend? Chances are you may not know anybody. How is it that professionals evaluate Asperger syndrome? I mean, how do they know who does and who doesn't have high-functioning autism? I mean, you can't take a blood test. There's no virus that you have. They can't do a X-ray and say, oh yeah, this guy's got Asperger bones. No, it doesn't work that way. So it's all based on behavior. And one of those behavior domains is communication. So let's talk about communication and when a professional does an evaluation. What are they looking for? Number 1 is they are looking for verbal communication, because people with Asperger syndrome, they say, tend to be highly verbal. What exactly does that mean? Well, you've heard the expression that a picture paints 1,000 words. Well, a person who has Asperger syndrome may prefer the 1,000 words to the picture because they think verbally. That's not to say that there are a lot of Aspies out there who aren't, for example, painters, who don't appreciate visual arts, who don't like a nice-looking car, they don't. It's not to say that they don't appreciate Rembrandt or something, to that akin. Personally, there's some artists that I don't appreciate because, modern art, who came up with that? Jeez. But people with Asperger syndrome tend to be verbal. We prefer doing things that are verbal rather than doing things that are visual. Not every case, but most cases. For example, most Aspies that I know don't like to talk on the telephone. They'd rather send a text. They would rather send an email. Personally, I would rather communicate through email or text and talk on the telephone. And I understand that because people tell me, oh, you don't like to talk on the phone. They figure it out on their own. I never said, hey, I don't like to talk on the phone. I'd rather send text and emails. But people figure that out because they'll give me a call and, the mechanic, for example, you'll give me a phone call and I respond with a text. Or I was writing an article for somebody's blog, and they would call me and talk to me, or leave a message rather, and I would respond with a text message. I'd rather do that because, I'm verbal. It's not audio, it's writing. It's the words that I'm interested in. So somebody with Asperger syndrome may prefer reading a book than watching a movie. I find it distracting to watch movies. Now, again, this doesn't apply to everybody with Asperger syndrome. But you sit me down in front of a movie screen or in front of a television, and if it's fiction, I'm wondering, why did the screenwriter use that phrase? Why didn't they say something else? Why did they do the lighting that way? Why is the actor or actress making that particular face expression? What's going on here? How did they design that set? Because I know it's not real, but it looks so good. I just can't focus on fiction if it's a movie or if it's television, whatever. But reading, okay, that's a little bit different. Basically, fiction bothers me, but that's got nothing to do with anything. Number 2 is vocabulary. People with Asperger syndrome tend to use terms that are not commonly used by other people. Other people may understand what they mean, but they don't normally use them. For example, I was talking to somebody the other day, and they used the term negligible. Well, I know what that means. I just never hear people saying that very often, but that's the type of word that an Aspie would use because, well, it's the best word to use. That's pretty much it. People with Asperger syndrome tend to have an extensive vocabulary, and so they know the best word to use to express their thought. The problem is when you're expressing that thought, the other person isn't thinking the thought that you're expressing. They're thinking, why is that person using negligible? That's an odd word. So sometimes our communication is not as good as it should be because we're trying to make it too good, if that makes sense. Now, if you are a person with Asperger syndrome, you may notice that when you were little, people would say that you were mature for your age. Even into high school, they'd say you were mature for your age. They say you're kind of quiet, shy, but you're mature for your age. Then as you get to be an adult, they kind of switch that and they say that you're aloof. Well, it's the same behavior pattern, it's just different context. But it is vocabulary. One of the key things that helps us to identify somebody who has Asperger syndrome that sets us apart from neurotypical people. Number 3 is lacking reciprocation skills. I talked about this, I think, in a video yesterday, but that is when you're having a conversation which doesn't go very far because it's just not something that is natural for us. So we're talking to somebody or actually listening to somebody, and they say something, and then they get quiet because it's our turn to talk, and we don't reciprocate. We don't say anything because, what do we say? We heard, okay, cool. In fact, that is one of the words I use a lot. When I'm talking to somebody, they'll talk, and then I'll say, cool. Or I'll say, gotcha. I'll say, interesting. But I'm learning, 70 years old, nearly, and I'm still learning. This whole life has been a learning process. The reason I make these videos, just sharing with you some of these things that I've learned when I was your age, and just hopefully I can help you along. Number 4 is one-sided and self-focused conversations. So, yeah, we actually can talk. I'm living proof because I'm talking right now. But when we talk about things that we are interested in. Doesn't matter if anyone else is interested in them or not. Now, it's a little bit different on YouTube because people seek out videos and podcasts that they're interested in. So what is this guy talking about? Well, he's talking about Asperger syndrome. I'm interested in that. I can talk all day about that. So I'm a perfect fit to make videos on Asperger syndrome, so that's what I'm doing. But if I'm sitting, say, I don't know, in a restaurant with a friend who has absolutely positively no interest in autism whatsoever, and I get on a rant explaining all the ins and outs and the subtleties of Asperger syndrome. He's not interested, or she's not interested. They really don't care. But people with Asperger syndrome don't always realize that what is interesting to us is really not so interesting to everybody else. Now, other people have the same deficit, but it's particularly noticeable in people with Asperger syndrome, particularly when it's coupled with these other traits. Number 5 is we have literal understanding. Now, how often have you heard that? People will say things to people with Asperger syndrome, and we just assume that what they say, not always, but we just assume that what they say is really, really literal. So somebody will say, maybe we visit somebody and they say, well, come back and see us. The reason I use this illustration is I actually heard of somebody who did this. So they were visiting somebody's house, and the people, their host, said as they were leaving, walking down the sidewalk to get their car, come back and see us. And so they turned around and went back in the house. They took that a little bit too literal. Now, I think I know better. I don't think I would do that. I don't have an extreme problem with that, but I do have a problem with it. I can't tell you how many times people have said things kind of joking, and I didn't know they were joking. I thought they were being very serious. Oh, cool. Number 6 is just flat effect. That is to say that we're not very animated. That's a good way to say it. Facial expressions, body expressions, hand gestures, body movements. We tend to be kind of still, and I didn't know this. When I went in for my evaluation, it did not occur to me that I had flat effect. In fact, I never even thought about that. But after I was evaluated, the therapist put in the report that I received that that was one of the check boxes that I had flat effect. And I didn't realize it, but she had tried to change the tone of the conversation to see if I would change along with it. Try to make it a little bit lighthearted or maybe even funny. I didn't get it. She would change the lighting in the room, see if that would have any effect on me whatsoever, and no effect, had flat effect. So that is one of the traits of communication, because when we are communicating with people, it's not just verbal, it's also physical. Our facial expressions, our eye contact is part of that. As we mentioned earlier, our hand gestures, our body language, that is communicating as verbal communication. And it seems that people with Asperger syndrome not really good at that. At least we're not as expressive. Probably a better way to say it, because we're good at what we do. If flat effect is what somebody wants, hey, we're experts. We got it. It's all by observation. To my knowledge, there is no test you can take to verify whether or not a person has Asperger syndrome or whether or not he is autistic. A person with Asperger syndrome, they say, is a high-functioning autistic. But, there's no blood test you can take. They can't take a urine sample and say, yeah, this guy has autism. So how do they know? I mean, I was diagnosed as being autistic. And, there are just a lot of characteristics, a lot of boxes to check that verify that. And that's how they find out. That's how they make that determination. So what are some of those things? Well, the last 2 videos we made, we talked about some of them, but now we're going to talk about some that people find hard to put into a particular category, So let's talk about these things. Number 1 is people who evaluate us, diagnose us for autism. First thing they look at, not the first thing, I should say, one of the things they look at is our posture. If our posture is kind of awkward, if our movement is kind of awkward, that's typical among people with Asperger syndrome. People with autism. Somehow we just carry ourselves in a particular way that suggests that we're not really comfortable. Have you ever noticed that you can tell the way or identify people by the way they walk? I remember when I was a kid, sometimes when I grew up in the 50s and 60s when families had one car. It's hard to imagine today, but every family had a car. Just one car. And Dad would sometimes take the car to work, and when he did, that meant when Mom ran any errands, she had to catch the bus, say, for example, to go downtown, I'd go with her. Or maybe she'd walk up to the local store or whatever, but one car. Well, sometimes Mom needed the car. Well, Dad had to go to work, so Mom would take Dad to work, and when Dad got off work, we'd go pick him up, and I'd go with her. And I could tell. There was hundreds of guys coming out of the plant at the same time where my dad worked. And I could pick my dad out. Not by the way he looked, but he had this very unique walk about him. And I noticed that everybody does. There's just a way that there's something about our posture, something about our movement that is almost like a thumbprint, you know? It's a signature. And I could always see Dad coming even before I recognized him just by the way he handled himself. Well, that's kind of similar to what therapists do when they try to determine whether or not we have Asperger syndrome. They look at just the way that we handle ourselves. Number two is the way that we handle ourselves is often without coordination. I love basketball, but I can't play it because I'm not that coordinated. You know, I can dribble a ball, I can run, I love to play, but seems nobody wants to play with me unless they're on the opposing team. Then, oh yeah, sure, we'll play. You know, I can dribble, I can run, just can't do them at the same time because I just lack that coordination. But what I think is cool is to watch these other guys playing. And I wonder, how do they know? How do they know how to do that? How do they know how to coordinate themselves together? To me, it's just amazing. It's absolutely positively incredible. And I understand that because when I was a kid, I taught myself to play the piano. Wasn't particularly good at it, but I taught myself to bang out chords, you know, and make a song recognizable. And people would come along and they would say, how do you do that? How do you know how do you know what notes to play and when to play them? You know, because they're used to reading music. They didn't understand playing by ear, as they say, play by hearing. You just do it. And I would explain to them, you know, how do you talk? How do you know how to talk? How do you know what words to say and when to say them? You know, same principle. I guess the same thing with playing sports. You just know, but if you have Asperger syndrome, you got a blind spot in your brain. Number three is we tend to have this sensitivity to textures, maybe lights, noises, certain taste. Depends on the individual to what degree and to what things they are particularly sensitive to. But one of the things about people who are autistic is they have these sensitivities that are not common among neurotypicals. I particularly have a problem with textures. When I was growing up as a kid, I had no idea why. I didn't know what Asperger's was. I didn't know what autism was. Never heard of it. In fact, most people never heard of it. But there it was. You know, the evidence of it was when I'd put on clothes, you know, I had to wear very specific clothes. Otherwise, I was uncomfortable. Nobody understood it. They couldn't, what's the word? They couldn't identify with what I was going through. They felt perfectly comfortable in clothes. All right, so if you put on a shirt made out of sandpaper with the sand on the inside, if you put on wool, you remember back when wool was actually felt like wool, people would understand that. Well, imagine everything feels like wool, you know? That is what I felt when I put on a dress shirt, I put on dress pants, you know, just particularly in the summertime when it's hot. Lights, some people are sensitive to lights. I get migraines. Some people with autism have a problem with noises. My sister, who I think was autistic, never diagnosed, but she had this thing where if you whistle, she'd yell at you because it bothered her ears, I think. And both my sister and I were able to hear this high-pitched sound when you would pull up to a traffic light. I don't think that is there anymore. We're talking about back in the early 60s, maybe late 60s. There was something about some traffic lights that something in the mechanism that you could hear this weird noise. Now, one thing I've never been able to do, but I wish I could, I can't hear radar. Now, that would be very useful, but unfortunately, I don't know anybody could do that. Same thing applies to taste. I don't think I've got a problem with that, but I've read that a lot of people with Asperger syndrome have a problem with particular taste. If you do, you could tell me about it in the comments, tell others about it. But probably that could be a good thing. You know, if you have a problem tasting some things, that my problem is I think everything tastes good. If it's real food, I mean, if it's a consumable, chances are I consume it. Yeah, I got a little weight problem, and I'm working on that. Lost 100 pounds, by the way, the last 5 years. Number four is we tend to be topic focused. We will have some topic that we're really zeroed in on, and we will focus on that, and we will focus on it, and we can become experts in this tiny sliver of an area of an area of an area. That can be a very good thing, because if somebody needs an expert in this, the person with Asperger syndrome is the guy to go to. But the downside of that is chances are whatever that thing that you're very interested in really doesn't play well in the world at large. So it's really not always a marketable skill, but sometimes it is. But nonetheless, that is a characteristic. So if you have a specific topic and you want to share it with our other readers, or listeners rather, feel free to mention that in the comment sections. Well, you have a comment section so people can talk to each other. Number 5 is we love routines and we don't like changes, Spreadsheets, I like to say, were made for Aspies. Spreadsheets were made for people with Asperger syndrome because we could put everything in a row. We could put a time and a date on it when it needs to be done. Calendar is really cool for people with Asperger syndrome. We tend to make good accountants because we like things organized and neat and in a row and easily verifiable. So I have spreadsheets. I don't call it a diet, I call it a meal plan, and it's on a spreadsheet. I've done that for years. Back when I was in better shape and I was able to exercise, I would have my exercise routine on a spreadsheet. When I do housework, chores around the house, I have days that I do certain things, and that's on a spreadsheet. Somewhere. I don't look at it anymore because I pretty well have it memorized. But we like routines and we don't like changes. This is the way it's done, and that can be a negative, particularly if somebody comes up with a better way of doing something. But we've always done it that way. You hear somebody say that, there's a possibility they could be an Aspie. So we sometimes a little reluctant to change. We need to change that, but we're not going to change it because we're reluctant to change. Number 6 is we have this propensity for anxiety and depression. There is a serious problem with people with Asperger syndrome and autism in general, who they tend to be anxious, particularly around other people, but because they have been rejected, I think, because they've been rejected so often, that just enhances their depression. And it's, but I say their depression, I'm just kind of assuming that everyone with Asperger syndrome has depression, which is not true. I'm sure there are some exceptions, but I think the ideation is like 60%, according to one study. I mean, it is that severe. So that is one of the characteristics and traits of autism that we need to be aware of. Well, there's something else that a lot of people just don't think about. Number 7 is people with Asperger syndrome a lot of times have trouble sleeping. There's something about sleep deprivation that just kind of wears you out. And people wonder, why is it that my kid won't get out of bed? Well, first of all, he may be lazy, but then again, maybe not. Maybe there's something deeper than that. And it could be because, well, does he have Asperger syndrome? I mean, are there other traits that point to Asperger syndrome, and maybe that's underlying? There was an article published in spectrumnews.org that explained that. Let me see if I can find that on the screen here. The article is called Genetic Roots of Sleep Issues, Autism May Be Entwined. And the byline is James Pruden. According to this article, about 23% of autistic participants had insomnia or took melatonin compared to 1.1% of controls. The study shows, what's more, the relatives of autistic people are also at increased odds of having insomnia. So there is definitely, definitely is highly likely a connection between insomnia and having Asperger syndrome or autism. Then there's this thing called being a savant. Well, what is a savant? That is somebody who is a specialist in a very narrow field. That's kind of like what we talked about before. But it is defined by Merriam-Webster as a person affected with a developmental disorder such as autism or intellectual disability who exhibits exceptional skill or brilliance in some limited field such as mathematics or music. Now, I got to say this, that when you find an autistic, chances are you're going to find somebody with autism. That is problematic because every time you see a savant, when the media reports it, they say the person is autistic. They bundle the two together. That gives a false impression that every person who is autistic must be a savant. Not necessarily a very small percent. From what I've read, very small percent of autistics actually are savants. But if you are a savant, chances are you're autistic. Not vice versa. And then number 9 is, this is kind of incidental, but people with Asperger syndrome, the thing that separates them from autism in general, they're really not separated, but they're, what would we call it, labeled, is that they have an average IQ. So if you are autistic and you have an average IQ or higher than average IQ, then you are identified as a person who is autistic but you're high functioning, or you have Asperger syndrome. Let's keep talking if you want. There are 2 rectangles on the screen. To keep our conversation going, just click on one of those 2 rectangles and we'll keep hanging out. But if you're done, well, thanks for stopping by and see y'all next time.